Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Exploring Photography right here on Adorama TV. I'm Mark Wallace. Well, I am on my balcony in my little apartment in Buenos Aires, Argentina. You can see it's sort of a cool little spot here. I am still in quarantine. It's a day 120 something down here, so I'm not able to go out and do any kind of photo shoots to get into the studio. But what I can do is take advantage of the situation I'm in. And I have this awesome balcony. And if we look right over here, see if I can get this little robot camera to move. There it is. We can see that there's some really cool buildings behind me. And so what I thought is I want to shoot some star trail photography to show the building with the stars moving behind it. So how can we do that? Well, here's some cool news. Normally when you're doing astrophotography, shooting the Milky Way or something, you can't do that in a city because of the light pollution. But you can create star trails just about anywhere, even in a place like this with tons of light pollution. And it's very, very simple. So what the heck are star trails? Well, it's pretty simple. As the Earth rotates, the stars in the sky seem to move because of the rotation of the Earth. And if you can put your camera on a slow enough exposure, you can sort of blur those stars, and so you see the trails. You can see how they move across the sky. Now, back in the olden days, you might have to do a 7-hour exposure, but we just don't do it like that anymore. There's a much better and simpler way. It's very, very simple. What we do is we're going to point our camera to the sky, make sure it's all set, and instead of taking one super long exposure, we're going to take hundreds, perhaps thousands of small photos. And then we're going to take all those photos, use software to put them together, and then we'll have one complete photo in the end that we can edit just like a normal photo. And it's going to be pretty spectacular. Now to do that, we need to have the right software, we need to have the right gear, and then we have to have the right camera settings. We're going to break it down step by step. First, let's talk about the software. Now, I've put links to this software in the description of this video so you know where to find it. You don't have to use this software. You can Google search all kinds of software, but this is the stuff that I recommend. The first thing is we need to figure out what the proper exposure times and where to point your camera. And that can be really complicated. It's a rabbit hole that you can go down and take forever. But there is an app called Photo Pills that I highly recommend. I've got a little iPad here with it loaded up. And what it allows you to do is you can calculate your exposure times to figure out exactly where you are and how long your shutter should be. So we're going to be using that. And it also has this augmented reality. I don't know if you can see this here. And so on your screen, you can actually point your iPhone or Android or iPad or whatever tablet to the sky, and you can actually see where the stars are going to be in the sky. It's great if you're going to be shooting the Milky Way or star trails or any of that kind of astrophotography. It's a great planner. I highly recommend it. So we have that. The other thing we need is a software that will put all those star pictures together. The really popular app that's free that a lot of people use is called Star Tracks. It is available for Windows and Mac, but I'm using a Photoshop plugin called AstroPanel because it has a little bit more functionality and features that I like. Anyway, links are in the description of this video, and check those guys out. The next thing we need is the proper gear. So I've got my Sony a7 III here that I'll be using. You can use any camera really, but what you need is you need a nice stable tripod, because we're going to be taking pictures and the camera can't move for 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours. It has to stay on that tripod for hours and hours to capture all of those images. So you need to have a really nice, strong tripod. The other thing you're going to want to have is a wide angle lens, because you want to capture the sky. So not a telephoto lens, you need a wide angle lens. I am using a 21mm lens because that's the widest angle lens that I have with me. A 16mm lens, 35mm lens, something in the wide area is really going to work out for you. Now on my camera here, I have a Leica lens on a Sony camera because I only have Leica lenses with me. And so I have a little lens adapter that allows me to do that. And so that's what this little red thing is here on my camera. The other thing that I prefer for shooting this type of photography is a manual prime lens with lens markings on it, because it helps you focus much, much easier. And so that's what I'm using, a 21mm totally manual lens. All right, the other thing that we're going to need is a large capacity storage card. So in my camera here, I've got a large capacity card that will allow me to shoot several thousand images in RAW, so make sure you don't have a small capacity card. And then the other thing we need is we need power that's going to last all night long. And so normally on a camera, so I've got my normal little battery here, I'll take that out. These guys are going to be pretty good for, you know, a couple hundred shots, but when you get up into the thousands and thousands of shots and hours, well, you're going to run out of battery power. So you don't want to have to be stopping and starting your camera to replace batteries, because you can move the camera. It's going to not work out. So what I use instead is something called the case relay. And so there's a battery adapter that goes into the camera, and then I can close that, put it on my tripod, and then that connects to this. This is my case relay. And what my case relay has, this has a battery inside it, and then it connects to any kind of USB battery that you want. And so I have an Anker battery here that's a super high capacity battery. So when I plug this into that, what's going to happen now is this large Anker battery is powering the case relay, which powers my camera. If for some reason this large battery dies, I can unplug it, and the case relay is still powering the camera even though it's not plugged in, because this has a battery inside. And then I can change out this battery with another battery and then plug this in, and I'm never ever taking power away from my camera. It will last all night. So on this giant battery that I have right now, I have been shooting 12 or 13 hours with zero problems. It doesn't even touch the capacity of this battery. So the case relay is a huge benefit if you're shooting multiple exposures into the thousands like we're doing here right now. Well, now that we have the gear sorted, it's time to start having fun and making photos. Now, obviously, I am out here on my balcony in the daytime, and that's simply because I don't have any lights to light up this scene at night. And so you don't want to watch a video of me in complete darkness. So obviously, when you're doing this, you would be doing this at nighttime after the sun goes down. All right, well, we need to break this up into two smaller parts. The first part is getting our camera set up for star trail photography, and then the second part is getting all the exposure and everything dialed in, and then we'll start shooting. And it's pretty darn simple. So what we're going to do here is, first, let's talk about the things we need to set our camera to. The first one is obviously manual mode. You need to shoot in manual mode because we have to control everything. We don't want the camera to overthink this. The second thing we want to do is go in and make sure that you're shooting in RAW mode. We want to have the absolute maximum ability to process these photos in post. RAW is going to do that. If you love shooting JPEGs, then at least shoot RAW plus JPEG, so you have the ability to choose between those two things. The next thing we want to do is we want to go into our menu setting here, and we need to turn off long exposure noise reduction. Why? Well, how noise reduction works for long exposures is the camera is going to take a long exposure, let's say 30 seconds or so, and then after that's done, the shutter closes, and then the camera takes another photo for the same amount of time, so another 30 seconds. And then the camera will compare the dark photo, it'll look and see if it has any noise or dark pixels or things that are problematic, and then it'll remove that from the photo that you took, and it will remove the noise as best that is possible. That's really awesome if you take one or two pictures, but we're going to be taking hundreds, perhaps thousands of pictures, and so that's going to effectively double the amount of time that our camera is working, and it's going to put big gaps between the pictures of each star photo that we get. We don't want that. And so we're going to turn long exposure noise reduction off. If you can, turn that off in your camera. Okay, let's talk about our aperture and ISO and shutter and all of that kind of stuff. So, what we're going to use here is we want to have the maximum amount of light coming into the lens. And so I'm putting my aperture at 3.4. That's the widest that this lens can open up. So whatever the widest aperture that your lens has, that's what you should use. The second thing we want to do is we need to figure out the shutter speed for our camera. That's where the app PhotoPills is going to come in, because we want to use something called the MPF rule. That's the rule that says wherever you are in the world, where you can take a photo without having the stars be blurry. So that's a rabbit hole you can go down. You can Google the MPF rule. We're not going to get into that. Just use PhotoPills. That exposure time is going to be somewhere between 15 seconds and 30 seconds. So if you don't have the app, start at 15 seconds and go from there. Between 15 and 30 seconds is where you want to be. For me, I use the app, and my proper exposure time is 15 seconds with this lens at f3.4. So what is the proper ISO? Well, hang on to that. We're going to get there a little bit later. So we have the shutter speed and aperture. We'll get to the ISO later. All right, focusing. What we're going to do here is I want to make sure that I have a focus where I can see the stars way, way far away. It's billions of miles away, so normally I would just focus at infinity. I'd be fine. But I want the buildings in front, so the buildings across the street and the stars. So I'm going to focus my camera at hyperfocal. And so I have made videos about hyperfocal focusing and shooting. The links are in this video. We don't have time to go into that, but that's one of the reasons I love a manual lens with lens markings, because I can quickly set my camera and focus it to hyperfocal distance where everything is in focus. If you don't have that on your lens, here's a trick. Just focus at infinity, way off into the stars, and then focus closer and closer and closer until whatever the object is you want in the foreground is in focus, and then stop. That should be just fine for your star trail pictures. You'll have to experiment a little bit if you have a lens that doesn't have markings and you don't exactly know where hyperfocal is, but that's half the fun of doing this. Okay, so we have manual mode, manual focus, 3.4, about 15 seconds for our exposure. We're gonna get to ISO later. There's one other thing that we have to use, and that is called interval shooting. Interval shooting just says when you start taking a picture on the camera, we want the camera to take a picture and another picture and another picture, and just keep taking a picture until it's reached the end of the number of pictures we've told it to take. And so you might not have interval shooting on your camera. In fact, when I started doing this video on my Leica, I shot some pictures, and on my Sony, I shot some pictures. Neither one of them had interval shooting until they updated the firmware. And so make sure that you have the latest firmware on your camera, because you might not have interval shooting in the menu. If you've updated to the latest firmware and you still don't have interval shooting, then what you'll need to do is buy something called an intervalometer. An intervalometer is just a little device that hooks up to your camera, and you can tell it, hey, take 1,000,000 pictures or however many pictures you want, and it will automatically tell the camera to keep taking pictures. I put links in the description of this video to help you find an intervalometer for your camera. Okay, so the other thing, there's some other settings that we need to do with the interval shooting. And so interval shooting, not only will you turn it on, you have to tell the camera how many photos to take. Well, I'm gonna have my camera just going all night. So I'm gonna tell my camera to shoot, I don't know, let's say 4,000 shots. It doesn't matter, it's some huge number. So once I have that entered in, it's also gonna ask me what the shooting interval is. In other words, how much time between each shot should I take? So I'm putting my camera at 2 seconds. In other words, take a photo. Once that photo is done, wait 2 seconds, take another photo. Once that photo is done, wait 2 seconds, and just keep going until it reaches that 4,000 photo mark that I set in there, which will be all night long. The reason that we're putting a little time between each photo is because when you're shooting hundreds of pictures like this, the camera sensor is going to start heating up. It's going to need a little bit of a break to cool down. So 2 seconds should work just fine in normal climates. Now I'm in winter down here, it's a little bit cold, and so 2 seconds, I probably don't even need that. But if you're in Arizona or something in the Northern Hemisphere, you might need longer than 2 seconds to allow your camera to cool down just a bit. So you'll have to experiment with that and keep an eye on your camera. All right, so we have all of that stuff. The last thing we need to do is take a test shot, do our dark shots, and that will help us figure out our ISO. So let's do that next. The sun has gone down. We're ready to put everything into practice and start making our awesome star trails. Now, what we need to do now is we need to figure out where to point our camera in the sky, and we need to set our ISO, and then we just need to start shooting. So where do we point the camera? Well, we need to make sure that we point the camera to the northern star so that all the stars are rotating around, or if you're in the southern hemisphere, maybe to the south. Now you can look at a bunch of star charts and learn about the constellations and figure out exactly where to do that, or you can do what I'm doing, which is using the PhotoPills augmented reality night mode. So I'm just using my iPad, I can point it at the sky. So when I do that, I can actually see exactly where the stars are going to be in the sky and see exactly where to compose my shot. So it's really easy. I love PhotoPills. So I'm going to do that. I can see, yeah, the stars are going to be right up there. It's perfect. So using that information, I'm going to turn my camera on. I'm going to compose the shot about like that. It's great. I've got this little pop-out screen that helps me. I've got my composition set, PhotoPills. It's a huge time saver. All right, again, I'm 3.4, 15 seconds. What is the ISO setting? Well, to do that, what we need to do is do a few test shots. Now, I've already done this previously to this, and I know that my ISO that is the spot on here is ISO 250. But what you would normally do is you would start at the lowest ISO value of maybe 100, take a test shot and work your way up until you get those stars nice and bright without overexposing everything. We're not shooting Milky Way photos where we would normally crank up our ISO to 4,000, 8,000, way up there. That's not what we're doing. We're going to keep our ISO low. We only want the stars to just show up as pinpricks because we can put those all together and make those star trails. Also, I don't want the foreground to be overexposed with the high ISO. So for me, 250 works great. Now, to make sure that you have the right ISO and exposure, what I recommend you do is take a few test shots, throw those on your computer, or maybe shoot tethered, and then check to see what the exposure is the best. And of course, shoot raw so you have a little bit of leeway. All right, so I've dialed mine in using some test shots. ISO 250, 3.4, 21 millimeter lens, 15 seconds. I need to do one other thing, and that is I need to take some dark photos. So what that means, I'm going to take my lens cap, I'm going to put that on my camera. So I'm going to block the lens. I'm going to block that right up, and then I'm going to take 5 photos. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Make sure you use the exact same settings that you would normally use. So 15 seconds, 3.4, ISO 250. I'm going to take 5 photos. We're going to use those in post-production to help reduce the noise, because remember, we turned long exposure noise reduction off. So essentially, we're taking these photos to take care of that in post. All right, so normally I would take 4 more pictures, but to save time, I'm going to take my lens cap off. Now all I need to do here is go in, turn on my interval shooting. So that's on. And then I hit go, and then I'm just going to let my camera go for 7, 8 hours. I'm going to go watch some Netflix, take a nap, drink some coffee, whatever I need to do, and just let my camera roll. The other thing you might want to do is turn off your screen so that it's not showing anything through the night, because that could also run your battery down just a bit. So I'm going to turn off the display on my screen. So it's just going to shoot. It's going to take a picture, 15 seconds, take a rest for 2, 15 seconds, take a rest for 2 seconds, for 4,000 pictures, or until I tell it to stop shooting. So I'm going to let it do that, and then we're going to hop into the computer and put everything together. Whew. All right, well, it's the next day. I have loaded all of those photos into my computer here. You can see I shot about 1,800 files. So I didn't do the full 4,000. I just told my camera to stop shooting after I think about 7 hours. So now I have those in my computer. What I'm going to do now you can do this in Adobe Bridge, you can do it in Lightroom, you can do it in Capture One, whatever software you want. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the very first raw file and I'm going to make some adjustments to it, fix the white balance and some other things, and then apply that to everything else before I load that into Photoshop. Now remember, you can use Star Stacks. Sorry, I called it Star Tracks earlier. It's Star Stacks. It's absolutely free software for Windows and Mac. They've got a great user manual on how to do all of this stuff, but it's essentially the same thing I'm going to be showing you here in Photoshop. So let's just hop over to Bridge really quickly. And you can see here, when I was shooting the video outside, these are the first dark photos I took. I should have done 5, but I only did 2 because I was making the video. And you can see these photos here. I set my white balance manually and I just overshot it. So it's way too blue. And then you can also see that there's some vignetting to the side. So I want to fix that in all of these files. So I'm just going to open Camera Raw. Remember, you can do this in Lightroom or Capture One, whatever you want. And then I've already made a preset to fix all this stuff. So I've called it Buenos Aires Star Trails. And so that's fixed the vignetting and the white balance and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm just going to say done. Now that I've done that to this first photo, I will just go up here and say Edit, Develop Settings, Copy Camera Raw Settings, and then I will just apply those settings to all the other files. So I'm just selecting all of those, going to Edit, and then Develop Settings, and then I'll paste those Camera Raw settings. Remember, you can do this in Lightroom by syncing all the files. In Capture One, there's similar functionality, but we want to make sure all of those raw files have the basic adjustments done before we hop over into Photoshop. Well, now those are all synced up, so all I'm going to do here is zip over into Photoshop, and then in Photoshop, I'm going to go up here to Window, Extensions, Astro Panel 4.2, so I've already installed that. When I click that, it's just going to open a blank, no document at all. It's just going to open the panel here. So what I want to do is I want to zip over to the Fusion tab right here, and then I want to choose Star Trails. Now we've got some very basic functionality. It's so easy. So I'm going to click on this dark right here. I'm going to look for those dark photos. And so I have those 2 that I shot. So I'll select both of those, click open, and you can see that shows 2 photos. It should be 5, remember. I only shot 2 because I was making a video for you guys. Now I need to click on this where it says light, and that's where I load in all those other files. So I'm just going to take this and we'll show a list here. And then what I'll do is I'll go down, it starts right here at 16. All right, I have selected all of these files, and you can see there are a ton of files here. And so I'll just click open. That's gonna load these in, and there are 1,802 files, which is exactly what I shot last night. The next thing I need to do is just choose some options here. There's a great user manual that's included in AstroPanel that tells you what these are, but I'm gonna turn on rotation direction and the comet star effect. You can turn these on and off depending on your tastes. But once you do that, you've got your light photos in, you've got your 5 dark photos if you've taken 5 dark photos, and then you just need to click this which says blend. And when you do that, well, Photoshop is going to jump into action. Now that I've started that, this could take 2 or 3 or 4 hours depending on how many files you have and how fast your computer is. So I'm gonna let that go, and then with the magic of editing, we'll show you the results. Wow, okay, so this is our final result here. Everything has been blended. And so I can use some different tools here in the Astro panel to change the colors and all kinds of things, or I can just close this and edit this photo just like any other photo in Photoshop. And so I'm going to do just a couple of fast things really fast to show you how I made my finished photo. This is my finished photo. You can see down here that I have done some things to the contrast and the color, and I've added some curves. I've also taken these buildings here. I changed the luminosity and the white balance and some other things. So I edited this just like I normally would with any other Photoshop document. And that's the joy of doing this. And that's why you want to shoot raw, because you can put everything together and then you can still manipulate it any way you want. It's really, really cool. Now, there's one thing I want to mention before we go. If you have an Olympus camera, you don't have to do all that post-production that I showed you to get into Photoshop. You can do all of that in the camera. In fact, Gavin Hoey is an expert at this, and so I've asked him to explain to us how that works.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, Olympus cameras, well, honestly, they do work exactly like any other camera, but if you want to bypass the whole post-processing part, you can do all of that in camera using something called Live Comp. Now, you'll find it on any Olympus camera by going to either the manual mode and taking the shutter speed all the way down, or go into bulb mode. Then, in Live Comp, you need to know what you've described. You need an aperture, an ISO, and a shutter speed. So you enter the aperture and the ISO, then press the menu button and enter the shutter speed. Point your camera at the stars, you'll need to imagine I've got some here, and then press the shutter once to take an establishing shot. Now, once that's done and you're completely happy, press the shutter a second time and you'll start recording your stars. And you really are recording them because they appear on the screen. And over time, you'll see it on the screen build up as a circle. It's really quite fun to watch. Once you're happy, you've got your long exposure done, press the shutter a third time to stop your star trails recording. All of the processing happens in camera, and that's it. You're done. You can walk away. No more work. Olympus has done all of that for you. So there you go, Mark. Back to you.
Well, thanks, Gavin. That is some really useful info. And wow, we have covered a lot in this episode. Now, if you're into star trails or astrophotography, maybe you have some questions or comments, well, tell us about it in the comments below, because we want to grow together as a community. Well, thanks so much for joining me for this episode. Make sure you subscribe to Adorama TV and turn on the bell so you get notifications. You don't want to miss out on anything, especially our live shows. So make sure you have that bell turned on. Thanks again for joining me, and I will see you next time.